It was a cool November evening in the rural outskirts of Cavite province when local police stumbled upon a grim discovery. Down a steep ravine in Maragondon lay the wreckage of a Toyota Delta, the vehicle belonging to Salvador Bubby Dacer, one of the Philippines' most prominent public relations men. The car had been rammed into the gully and abandoned just days earlier. Its windows were shattered, and scorch marks blackened portions of the interior, as if someone had tried to set it aflame to destroy evidence. There was no sign of Dacer himself, nor of his driver, Emmanuel Corbito. Standing over the twisted metal, officers could only guess at what had transpired. All that remained was a trail of smoke and a deepening mystery. Salvador Bubby Dacer was no ordinary kidnap victim. By the year 2000, the 66-year-old Dacer had made a name for himself as a top public relations practitioner in the Philippines. Born in Albay province, he rose to become a trusted PR advisor and spin doctor for the country's most powerful figures. His client list read like a who's who of Manila's elite, including former President Fidel Ramos and then President Joseph Arap Estrada. Dacer was the man politicians called to shape their public image or manage their crises, and he was reputed to know everyone's secrets. In public, he was affable and well-liked, often spotted puffing on a cigar as he regaled reporters with political anecdotes. In private, he was a widower raising 4 daughters, a doting father who hosted family golf outings and holiday dinners. He even supported dozens of poor children's education out of his own pocket. By November 2000, however, Dacer found himself in the eye of a political storm. That year, President Joseph Estrada was battling an impeachment effort sparked by corruption allegations. In the weeks before his disappearance, Dacer had been dragged into the intrigue swirling around Malacañang Palace. According to Dacer's family, about 1 week before he vanished, President Estrada summoned Dacer for a tense meeting at the presidential palace. There, Estrada angrily accused him of collaborating with the president's political enemies to support the impeachment drive that threatened Estrada's hold on power. The president delivered a severe tongue-lashing to the publicist, essentially blaming Dacer for fanning the flames of Estrada's impending impeachment. Shaken by the encounter, Dacer confided to his daughters afterward that he feared for his life. This private admission would later prove hauntingly prescient. Why would the president of the Philippines lash out at a PR man? As it turns out, Dacer had connections with rival power brokers. He was known to be on good terms with former President Ramos and other opposition figures. In fact, Estrada's security force, the Presidential Anti-Organized Crime Task Force, PAOCTF, had been monitoring Dacer's communications and activities. According to later court documents, the PAOCTF, led by then Philippine National Police Chief Panfilo Ping Lacson, had wiretapped Dacer's office phone. President Estrada had placed Lacson, a close ally, in charge of that agency, a special police task force originally created to fight organized crime. By late 2000, however, the agency's formidable resources were evidently being used to spy on perceived political threats, and Salvador Dacer was deemed one of them. Dacer had also reportedly opposed Lacson's promotion to PNP chief earlier that year, lobbying behind the scenes to block it. If true, that meant Dacer had managed to earn the ire of both the president and the president's top police general. It was a perilous position to be in. Emmanuel Corbito, by contrast, lived far from the halls of power. At 48 years old, Corbito was Dacer's personal driver and longtime employee. A family man and former police officer, Corbito's daily work largely involved ferrying Dacer to meetings around Metro Manila. He was described as quiet and reliable, the kind of person who toiled in the background but was deeply loyal to his boss. Tragically, his loyalty meant he accompanied Dacer everywhere, even into danger. In late November 2000, Corbito likely had no inkling that merely doing his job, driving Mr. Dacer to an appointment, would put him in mortal peril. Yet his fate would become inextricably intertwined with that of the high-profile publicist. The backdrop to their story is critical. The Philippines in late 2000 was rife with political tension. President Estrada was mired in a massive corruption scandal, the illegal gambling payoff scandal, and an impeachment trial was looming in Congress. Protests were gathering steam. In this charged atmosphere, powerful men were growing paranoid about plots and leaks. Rumors swirled that some of Estrada's former allies were switching sides. Dacer, with his vast network of contacts and insider knowledge, was viewed by some as a potential liability, someone who knew too much or was helping the opposition. Whether those suspicions were justified or not, a decision appears to have been made in certain circles. Bubby Dacer needed to be silenced. On November 24, 2000 in Makati City, the day began like any other for Salvador Dacer. That Friday morning, the publicist left his home to attend a meeting at the Manila Hotel, an upscale historic hotel where he often conducted business. Dacer's schedule was busy, but not unusual. He was set to meet a prominent politician that morning, and as always, his driver Emmanuel Corbito was at the wheel of his Toyota sedan. The two navigated through the bustling streets of Metro Manila, heading toward the hotel located along Rojas Boulevard by Manila Bay. They never made it to their meeting. Around 11:30 a.m., as Dacer's Toyota crossed the intersection of South Superhighway and Zobel Rojas Street on the boundary of Makati and Manila, armed men intercepted the vehicle. Eyewitnesses later recounted the startling scene. Multiple vehicles converged on Dacer's car, forcing it to stop in traffic. A group of men, some wielding firearms or police badges, swiftly surrounded the sedan in broad daylight. Within moments, the bewildered Dacer and Corbito were forcibly removed from their car by the gunmen, bundled into another vehicle, and whisked away from the busy intersection. The abduction happened so quickly that by the time bystanders realized what was happening, the kidnappers' cars were already speeding off amidst the mid-morning traffic. This brazen kidnapping in a public area shocked those who witnessed it. Makati, the country's financial hub, is typically swarming with people and traffic. Yet the kidnappers executed their plan with chilling precision, suggesting they were highly trained or experienced. According to later investigations, the men who took Dacer and Corbito were members of the PAOCTF itself, the very law enforcement unit ostensibly devoted to combating crime. This would only become clear in the following months. But even on that day, there were telling clues. Several of the abductors reportedly flashed police or military identification to cow any onlookers who might intervene. In effect, a specialized government task force had turned into a kidnap squad. In the immediate aftermath, chaos and confusion reigned. Dacer's abandoned Toyota was left at the roadside of the intersection after the kidnappers drove off with their captives. When local police arrived, they found the empty vehicle with its engine still running and Dacer's personal belongings scattered inside. But there was no violence at the scene, no gunshots or blood, only skid marks and stunned witnesses. It was as if Dacer and his driver had been swallowed by the earth. Hours passed with no contact from the kidnappers. By nightfall on November 24th, the Dacer family's worst fears were taking hold. Phone calls to Bubby's mobile phone went unanswered. Friends and colleagues had no news. A missing person report was filed with authorities. Given Dacer's prominence, the news of his disappearance hit headlines almost immediately. PR man missing led radio and TV reports that evening. Top police officials in Metro Manila were alerted. President Estrada, when informed that his former publicist had been abducted, publicly ordered law enforcement to prioritize the case, at least in appearance. Privately, however, suspicion clouded the investigation. Could elements of Estrada's own security apparatus be involved? It was a question few dared to voice at the time. Meanwhile, Salvador Dacer and Emmanuel Corbito were in the grip of their captors, being driven to parts unknown. They had been effectively vanished. What unfolded in the hours immediately after their abduction would only be revealed much later through witness testimonies and affidavits. It is a chilling sequence of events pieced together from the accounts of those involved. and it would ultimately confirm that the kidnapping was not a simple ransom case. Unbeknownst to anyone in Manila, within mere hours of the abduction, Salvador Dacer and Emmanuel Corbito were taken south of the capital to the province of Cavite. The kidnappers kept to back roads, avoiding police checkpoints as they transported their two hostages. At some point, the victims were transferred into a van. According to later testimony by one of the conspirators, the kidnappers blindfolded Dacer as they drove, perhaps to disorient him or prevent him from recognizing where they were headed. Emmanuel Corbito, the loyal driver, was also bound and blindfolded, sitting helpless beside his employer. Their first stop was reportedly in Dasmariñas, Cavite, a suburban city about an hour's drive from Manila. There, in a secluded spot near some roadside eateries or KTV bars, several vehicles convened, effectively a rendezvous point for the abductors. Senior members of the PAOC-TF kidnap team were present. One of them was Police Chief Inspector Glenn Dumlao, Deputy Chief for Operations of PAOC-TF Luzon, who would later provide one of the most detailed insider accounts of this crime. Dumlao had been involved in planning surveillance on Dacer in the days prior. Now, faced with the captive publicist, he took on the role of interrogator. Glenn Dumlao later described in an affidavit how he interrogated Bubby Dacer inside a van in Dasmariñas. With Dacer's hands tied and eyes covered, Dumlao pressed him for information about former President Fidel Ramos and the opposition's plans against Estrada. It appears the abductors suspected that Dacer was a go-between or had knowledge of any plot by Ramos or others to undermine Estrada. Dumlao asked what Dacer and Ramos had recently discussed. The frightened publicist, struggling to maintain composure, replied that Ramos had only been seeking his advice on certain matters, nothing more. Dacer insisted he was a neutral party. "They're my longtime friends. Even in the administration I have many friends, but I always stay neutral and professional," he said in Tagalog, trying to convince his interrogators. As for any plans of the opposition, Dacer denied knowledge of any coup or destabilization plots, emphasizing his role as an advisor rather than a conspirator. Inside that stifling van, with perhaps a gun trained on him, Dacer could only hope his answers would satisfy the men in charge. Also in the van was a second blindfolded man, whom Dumlao did not initially identify, but it had to be poor Emmanuel Corbito, who, being just a driver, likely had no information to give. Despite the terror of the situation, Dacer's responses remained calm and truthful by all accounts. He admitted to having conversations with various political figures, that was part of his job, but denied being part of any scheme against Estrada. After a tense period of questioning, Dumlao realized that Dacer truly had no explosive information to reveal. The publicist was not some grand mastermind of Estrada's downfall. At most, he had been a messenger and advisor among bigger players. Frustrated, or perhaps convinced that further interrogation was pointless, Dumlao stepped out to consult with his superiors. He placed a phone call to his direct boss, Superintendent Michael Ray Aquino, the PAOC-TF Chief of Operations, and a trusted protege of General Lacson. It was Aquino who had ordered Dumlao to shadow Dacer days before. Now Dumlao reported that Dacer wasn't yielding any useful intel. Aquino's response over the phone was terse. "If you've gotten everything you can, secure any documents Dacer carried and return to base." In other words, Dumlao's part in this operation was done. Others would handle the rest. Around 2:30 p.m. that afternoon, another vehicle arrived at the Dasmariñas rendezvous. This car carried Police Senior Superintendent Teofilo Tito Vina, the task force's Visayas chief, and a former close aide of Lacson. Vina was a high-ranking officer alleged to be one of the operation's ringleaders. With Vina came a squad of men in two vehicles, an old model car and an SUV, Toyota Revo. At that point, Glenn Dumlao later recounted, he handed over the scene to Vina's team. Dutifully following Aquino's order, Dumlao took some documents and possibly computer diskettes that Dacer had with him, materials the team had been seeking as part of their intelligence mission. Then Dumlao left the area and drove back toward Manila and PAOC-TF headquarters, distancing himself from whatever was about to happen next. What happened next was nothing short of horrific. Vina and his men took custody of the two hostages from Dumlau's group. Dacer and Corbito were likely transferred again, perhaps to Vina's vehicles. They were alive but utterly at the mercy of their captors, who had decided that these two men would not be leaving Cavite alive. Vina's convoy drove deeper into the countryside, towards an isolated spot where they could commit murder without being seen. The killers found such a spot in Indang, Cavite, a rural town surrounded by farms and coconut groves. They turned onto a dirt path near a creek in Barangay Bunalejos, far from any prying eyes. There, in the late afternoon or early evening of November 24, 2000, the fate of Salvador Dacer and Emmanuel Corbito was sealed. Two local farmers from Indang, brothers Jimmy and William Lopez, would later admit they were recruited by the men as accomplices at the kill site. According to their testimony, the Lopez brothers were essentially forced to assist under threat. They, along with another local collaborator named Alex Deloy, were present at the scene and would help dispose of the bodies. Their chilling account provided the clearest picture of the crime. In the dim light of dusk, Dacer and Corbito were led, still bound and blindfolded, to a grassy area by a creek. A decision had been made to execute them. One of the farmers, Alex Deloy, was instructed to prepare a makeshift pyre, gather wood, dry leaves, and old tires into a pile. As Deloy piled up flammables, the PAO-CTF officers conferred. Among those present were Marino Soberano and Mauro Torres, both policemen with the agency. There was also Armando Ding de Pedro, a local municipal councillor who had been roped into this heinous act, and Benjamin Taladua, another PAO-CTF man. These individuals formed the core of the execution team. When the time came, the order was given. As Jimmy Lopez later recounted, he saw a group led by Soberano arrive at his brother's garage with the victims earlier, and now here in the creekside clearing, he watched as the prisoners were marched to their deaths. Emmanuel Corbito, the driver, and Salvador Dacer, the influential publicist, were strangled to death with a length of wire. At least one witness stated he saw Mauro Torres himself pull the wire around one victim's neck, while another conspirator handled the other. The men struggled briefly, but stood little chance against the armed multiple assailants. Within moments, both Dacer and Corbito collapsed lifelessly to the ground. Immediately, the killers moved to destroy evidence. The prepared pyre was doused with gasoline. The limp bodies of Dacer and Corbito were placed on the heap of wood and tires, then set ablaze. Thick, acrid smoke curled into the evening sky as the fire consumed the two men's remains. The burning reportedly lasted about half an hour. One can only imagine the eerie glow of the flames in that remote creek, and the silence among the perpetrators as they watched the evidence of their deeds turn to ash. After ensuring the bodies were thoroughly charred, the execution team scattered. Alex Deloy later said he took his leave as the fire died down, walking away under cover of darkness toward a nearby town. The PAO-CTF operatives gathered whatever personal items were left, rings, watches, perhaps the wire, and left the site. The Lopez brothers and their cohorts were given a small amount of cash for their help, a mere 1,500 pesos, around $30, for the life of each victim, one of them later revealed bitterly. It was an almost insultingly paltry sum, underscoring how little the masterminds valued these human lives or the local accomplices' loyalty. Thus, on November 24, 2000, in a quiet corner of Cavite, Salvador Bubby Dacer and Emmanuel Boy Corbito were brutally murdered, their bodies reduced to burnt remains. They were victims of a conspiracy that, as would soon emerge, involved not ordinary kidnappers, but members of the police force assigned to the highest office of the land. At that moment, however, their fate remained a mystery to the world. The conspirators thought they had covered their tracks, the bodies destroyed, the car dumped far away, and no witnesses left alive who would talk. But they were wrong. A trail of evidence, however faint, was about to lead investigators right to them. When Salvador Dacer and Emmanuel Corbito failed to return home on November 24th, alarm bells rang at once. Dacer's family, political clients, and friends frantically reached out to authorities. Given Dacer's prominence, the disappearance was treated with urgency from the get-go. Initially, the Philippine National Police, PNP, under Chief Panfilo Lacson, took charge of the search in Metro Manila. Roadblocks were set up, and a nationwide alarm was issued for Dacer's missing vehicle and any sign of the captives. Public speculation ranged from a simple kidnapping for ransom, a not uncommon crime in the Philippines, to a politically motivated abduction. The Estrada administration publicly expressed concern and vowed to find Dacer, with President Estrada himself telling media he wanted Dacer safely recovered. Behind the scenes, however, there were reasons to worry about the integrity of the investigation. The very task force that might have been expected to help, the Presidential Anti-Organized Crime Task Force, was potentially compromised, since high-ranking PAOCTF officers were the very suspects. It was a classic case of the fox guarding the henhouse. As days passed with no ransom call or contact from kidnappers, suspicions grew that this was no ordinary kidnapping. Dacer's family began to fear the worst. A crucial break came 3 days after the abduction. On November 27, 2000, acting on a tip, local police in Cavite discovered an abandoned vehicle pushed down a ravine in Maragondon, Cavite. It was Salvador Dacer's Toyota, a fact confirmed by its license plates and registration. The car's discovery, reported in the news on November 29th, sent chills through the country. If the motive was ransom, why dump the car? The location, a remote ravine far from Manila, suggested someone wanted to hide evidence. Investigators noted damage to the vehicle consistent with it being intentionally driven off the road. Some reports indicated there were burn marks, though whether the entire car had been set on fire or just partially burned was not clear. Either way, the finding of the car was a turning point. It strongly indicated foul play. As one police official grimly noted, "This doesn't look good." The case now had the full attention of national investigative agencies. President Estrada instructed the National Bureau of Investigation, NBI, the DOJ's investigative arm, independent of the PNP, to get involved and work alongside the police. The Department of Justice formed a special task force of prosecutors to begin a preliminary investigation into the possible crime. In the Philippine system, a preliminary investigation is a formal inquiry to determine whether there is enough evidence to file criminal charges and information in court. By early December 2000, the DOJ panel was issuing subpoenas and gathering statements. Given the political sensitivity, the DOJ panel operated somewhat covertly at first, knowing that if their suspicions about insider involvement were accurate, tipping their hand could allow suspects to flee or destroy evidence. Throughout December 2000 and into January 2001, leads were developed quietly. Phone records were pulled. Investigators tried to trace Dacer's last known movements. One revealing clue came from the Manila hotel. Records showed that on the morning of November 24th, a certain Erwin Chavez had checked into a room adjacent to Dacer's usual meeting spot. This turned out to be an alias used by Glenn Dumlao. In other words, operatives had been tailing Dacer even at the hotel, likely in preparation for the abduction. This was a smoking gun suggesting official complicity. But to act on it, the DOJ needed first-hand witnesses. The political context dramatically shifted in the middle of the investigation. On January 20th, 2001, President Joseph Estrada was ousted from power following the EDSA II People Power Uprising. Vice President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo assumed the presidency. Almost immediately, the tables turned. Those who were protectors under Estrada became potential targets under Arroyo, and vice versa. Arroyo's new government had an interest in pursuing justice for the Dacer Corbito case, not least because one of the implied suspects, Panfilo Lacson, had just been elected to the Senate in 2001 and was an opposition figure to her. Moreover, uncovering the truth about Dacer's murder could further discredit Estrada's fallen administration. Thus, the investigation gained renewed vigor and independence after Estrada's departure. One of President Arroyo's first moves was to abolish the PAOCTF outright in early 2001. Given the task force's tainted record and involvement in this scandal, it was dismantled, with officers reassigned to various units. This meant the suspects no longer enjoyed the protection of their powerful unit. Some of them began to go into hiding. Others stayed on duty, but nervously watched the probe closing in. By March 2001, investigators got their first major breakthrough: witnesses. Acting on intelligence, NBI agents raided a farm in Indang, the very town where the murders occurred, and took into custody two farmers, Jimmy Lopez and Alex Deloy. These were small-time participants in the crime, and once separated from the influence of the ex-PAOCTF bosses, they proved willing to talk. On March 29, 2001, in a dramatic press conference, Justice Secretary Hernando Perez presented Lopez and Deloy to the media. The two, looking frightened and remorseful, confessed their roles in the crime and implicated a cadre of police officers in the abduction murder. They recounted in detail how Dacer and Corbito were strangled and burned, confirming what investigators had feared. These confessions were explosive. They directly named at least 4 members of the PAOCTF as co-conspirators, including Marino Soberano and Mauro Torres, whom they saw at the scene of the killings. They also mentioned a local official, Diego de Pedro, and indicated that the operation was orchestrated by higher-ups, notably pointing to Superintendent Teofilo Viña as the man who seemed to be in charge on the ground. Crucially, Lopez and Deloy led NBI agents to the very creek in Indang where the murders had taken place. Even though months had passed, investigators combing the site found evidence of human remains. Charred bone fragments and dental remains were recovered from the muddy creek side. Forensic experts, including pathologists from the University of the Philippines, examined the fragments. By April 2001, they managed to positively identify the remains as those of Salvador Dacer and Emmanuel Corbito, using dental records and personal effects found in the ash. The worst was confirmed. Dacer and Corbito were dead, and this was now officially a double murder case. The nation was horrified as details of the crime trickled out. Front-page headlines declared, "Dacer strangled, burned, 2 suspects talk." The Philippine Daily Inquirer ran the story of the farmer's confession, and the Philippine Star likewise reported the gruesome method of killing. The fact that policemen, elite anti-crime policemen at that, were named as suspects sent shockwaves. The Lopez and Deloy statements indicated that at least a dozen individuals took part in various stages of the plot. It was a conspiracy of significant scale. Justice Secretary Hernando Perez wasted no time. Based on the evidence gathered by the NBI and prosecutors, the Department of Justice formally filed charges. On May 11, 2001, the DOJ filed an information for double murder with the Regional Trial Court of Manila against multiple accused. Initially, the defendants were those directly implicated by the witnesses, the likes of Soberano, Torres, the Lopez brothers, Deloy, De Pedro, and a handful of other agency personnel, including lower-ranking officers present at the abduction. The case was raffled to RTC Manila Branch 41, with Judge Rodolfo Ponferrada presiding. As the legal process began, more suspects emerged. Under questioning and surveillance, other PAOCTF men were identified. For example, Chief Inspector Vicente Arnado was tagged by Soberano and Torres as the one who gave the order to abduct Dacer in Manila. Another officer, SPO-1 Ruperto Nemeno, confessed his minor role as a lookout in the abduction and corroborated Arnado's involvement. Nemeno actually surrendered to authorities on May 27, 2001, just before warrants were issued, possibly hoping for leniency. He would later turn state witness. By the end of May 2001, the Manila RTC had issued arrest warrants for 22 individuals tied to the Dacer Corbito murders. These included police officers of varying ranks and some civilian accomplices. Several were already in custody, the Lopezes, Deloy, Nemeno, etc. But others were on the run. One by one, however, some turned themselves in. On June 4, 2001, one of the bigger fish, Senior Superintendent Glenn Dumlau, was arrested by authorities. Dumlau had fled to the provinces, but was caught. When interrogated, Dumlau provided an affidavit confirming much of what the other witnesses said, and crucially, he hinted that even higher officials might have had knowledge of the operation. Dumlau's affidavit claimed that President Joseph Estrada and PMP Chief Panfilo Lacson might have had knowledge of the murders. This was a bombshell. A sitting senator, Lacson had just won a Senate seat in the May 2001 elections, and a recently deposed president were being directly linked to the crime by an insider. Both Estrada and Lacson vehemently denied any involvement. Estrada, now detained on unrelated corruption charges, scoffed at the idea that he would order such a hit. Lacson, for his part, described the accusations as lies fabricated by underlings to save their own skin or curry favor with the new administration. Nevertheless, the pressure to investigate those links was intense. President Arroyo's DOJ knew the case had vast political implications. Justice Secretary Hernando Perez took a cautious approach. He announced that for now, there was no solid evidence directly implicating Estrada. Indeed, on June 25, 2001, Perez publicly cleared Joseph Estrada of involvement, citing lack of proof. The investigation had found no paper trail, no direct witness at that point tying Estrada to ordering the hit, beyond hearsay and innuendo. Many noted, however, that clearing Estrada so quickly, barely 5 months after the crime, might have been a political move to avoid inflaming Estrada's supporters, or because the priority target was someone else. Who then was left as potential mastermind? Eyes turned to Panfilo Lacson, the former PAOCTF chief. Many of the accused were his men, and one, Dumlau, intimated Lacson must have known what his aides were up to. However, no one had yet provided concrete evidence of Lacson's orders. In fact, the emerging narrative suggested an alternative mastermind, Teófilo Viña. The NBI and prosecutors initially suspected that Viña, as the on-site commander and a known close ally of Lacson, might have been the highest-ranking perpetrator directly involved. They even labelled Viña the mastermind in early reports, implying he may have coordinated with others to carry out the deed, possibly on behalf of someone else, but that link was murky. Viña, however, proved elusive. He had gone into hiding and would never face trial. He himself would be killed in 2003 under mysterious circumstances. By late 2001, the case against the primary suspects was moving forward in court. There were numerous procedural wranglings. The prosecution moved to amend the information, the charge sheet, to add new accused as evidence developed. Defense lawyers objected, but ultimately the courts allowed key amendments. Notably, in April 2002, the Court of Appeals granted a petition to include 3 additional names as co-accused: Michael Ray Aquino, Cesar Mancao II, and Teófilo Viña, all high-ranking agency officers. This was significant. Aquino and Mancao were top aides to Lacson, and Viña we already know about. The same Court of Appeals resolution also allowed the DOJ to discharge, some of the small fry from the charge sheet so they could serve as state witnesses. Specifically, the Lopez brothers, Jimmy and William, and Alex Deloy, the farmer witnesses, were formally removed as defendants in exchange for their testimony. This tactic of discharging accomplices to testify against the main accused is common in the Philippine justice system, but it requires court approval. The idea is that those with less culpability can be forgiven if their testimony can nail the bigger fish, provided their accounts are consistent and credible. In this case, the courts agreed these men were minor players and that their testimony was vital. With those adjustments, by mid-2002, the list of accused encompassed nearly the entire alleged kidnap-kill team, from lowly provincial hirelings to senior police officers. The stage was set for a long and complex trial. But events would take yet another twist. Some of the most important accused fled the country, turning the case into an international saga. Even as charges were being firmed up in 2001, 2 of the most prominent suspects, Michael Ray Aquino and Cesar Mancao II, slipped away. Aquino and Mancao were both high-ranking officers in PAOCTF and known protégés of Ping Lacson. Sensing that the net was closing in, they quietly left the Philippines in July 2001, mere weeks after their names began surfacing in the case, and their destination was the United States. By September 2001, they had been indicted in absentia in the Philippines, but serving arrest warrants was impossible with them overseas. For a time, Aquino and Mancao lived low-profile lives in the US, avoiding media attention. Glenn Dumlau, after initially cooperating in 2001, also grew skittish. By May 2003, Dum Lao fled the Philippines as well, joining his former colleagues in American exile. With 3 key suspects abroad, the Philippine government had to consider extradition, but that process can be slow and politically complicated. Back in Manila, the trial against the remaining accused in custody proceeded haltingly. Witnesses like the Lopez brothers and Deloy testified to what they knew. The evidence laid out a damning story of abduction and murder, but those arguably most accountable, the architects and senior officers, were not in the dock. This meant the question of ultimate responsibility remained an open wound. It wasn't until 2005 that external events shook things loose. In an ironic twist, Michael Ray Aquino got into trouble in the United States, unrelated to the Dacer case. He was arrested in September 2005 by the FBI for espionage, specifically illegal possession of classified US government documents, in what became known as the Filipino espionage case. Aquino's arrest and subsequent conviction in the US, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 76 months in prison, suddenly made him a high-profile detainee. The Philippine government saw an opening. Once Aquino served his US sentence, he could be extradited back to face the Emmanuel Corbito charges. Indeed, Aquino's legal troubles in the US directly paved the way for his eventual return to the Philippines. Meanwhile, the Philippine Department of Justice under President Arroyo did not forget about Mancao and Dum Lao. In 2006, a Manila court reaffirmed there was probable cause to prosecute Mancao, Aquino, and 18 others for the double murder, and it reissued warrants for the arrest of the fugitive officers. Formal extradition requests were lodged with the US State Department. In 2008, acting on those requests, US authorities arrested Cesar Mancao II and Glenn Dum Lao in the States. Both men fought extradition initially, but by early 2009, they signaled willingness to return to the Philippines, especially as they struck deals to possibly become state witnesses rather than accused. The return of Mancao and Dum Lao marked a new chapter. In February 2009, while still in US custody, Cesar Mancao II executed a sworn affidavit detailing his knowledge of the Dacer Corbito plot. This affidavit caused a media sensation because Mancao directly implicated Senator Panfilo Lacson as the mastermind. Mancao claimed that about a month before the murders, he had overheard Lacson instruct Michael Ray Aquino to neutralize, i.e., kill, Salvador Dacer. According to Mancao, this conversation took place in October 2000, and Lacson was explicit that Dacer should be eliminated. Mancao's statement essentially pointed the finger at Lacson as giving the order from the top. He also implicated his friend Michael Ray Aquino as the chief coordinator who carried out Lacson's orders. This was precisely the kind of evidence that had been missing, a link to a higher authority giving the kill order. Mancao's bombshell prompted Dacer's 4 daughters to renew their quest for justice. In March 2009, the Dacer family formally petitioned the DOJ to reopen the investigation and include Senator Lacson among the accused. The Arroyo administration, which viewed Lacson as a political adversary, embraced this development. By early 2010, the DOJ moved to indict Lacson, but Senator Lacson did not wait to be arrested. In January 2010, just as the courts issued murder charges and an arrest warrant against him, Lacson disappeared from the Philippines. He secretly left the country, going on the lam to evade arrest. It turned out he traveled through Southeast Asia and eventually hid in Hong Kong and perhaps other countries, staying one step ahead of manhunts. Lacson publicly proclaimed his innocence via statements released from hiding, arguing that the charges were trumped up and politically motivated by the Arroyo administration. This period, in which a sitting senator became a fugitive, gripped the nation. It underscored how politically entangled the case had become, even a decade after the crime. While Lacson was in hiding, events in the Philippines shifted yet again. In mid-2010, Gloria Arroyo's presidency ended, and Benigno Noynoy Aquino III, son of former President Cory Aquino, was elected president. The change in administration would prove fortunate for Lacson. In 2011, the Philippine Court of Appeals closely reviewed the basis of the case against Lacson, which hinged largely on Mancao's testimony. The appellate court found Mancao's statements inconsistent and insufficient to establish probable cause. Specifically, they noted that Mancao had given multiple affidavits that contradicted each other on key points, undermining his credibility. Because of these issues, in February 2011, the Court of Appeals dismissed the murder charges against Lacson and nullified the warrant for his arrest. In effect, the court cleared Lacson, citing insufficient evidence. The Department of Justice under the new administration did not appeal that ruling, making Lacson's exoneration final. Free of the legal threat, Senator Lacson emerged from hiding in March 2011 and resumed his seat in the Senate. By late 2011, even the Supreme Court affirmed the dismissal. Lacson was clear of any liability in the Dacer case. For the Dacer family and many observers, Lacson's clearance was a severe blow to the search for ultimate justice. If not him, then who was truly behind the murders? The case was left with just the direct perpetrators being prosecuted. Let's return to Mancao and Dumlao, the extradited officers, and see what became of them. Cesar Mancao had initially agreed to be a state witness upon his return in June 2009. He was feted as a star witness for the prosecution, protected under the DOJ's Witness Protection Program. Glenn Dumlao also cooperated. In fact, the charges against Dumlao were dropped, and he was discharged from the case in 2009, recognizing that his testimony was helpful and that he had not been a triggerman, but rather an accessory who didn't partake in the actual killing. Dumlao was allowed to rejoin the police in a non-sensitive position later on, his slate somewhat cleaned due to his cooperation. Mancao's trajectory was different. Initially, his words were the linchpin for nabbing Lacson, but once Lacson's case was dropped, Mancao's utility to the prosecution diminished. Moreover, scrutiny of Mancao's credibility increased. Defense lawyers noted that Mancao had cut a deal to save himself and might have embellished his story. In 2011, the Court of Appeals explicitly declared Mancao unfit as a witness. They pointed out that under oath, he contradicted himself on material points, and that such inconsistencies affect the credibility of Cesar Mancao and the veracity of his statements. Following that ruling, the DOJ had no choice but to remove Mancao from the Witness Protection Program in January 2012. He was no longer an immune witness. He was reverted to being an accused in the double murder case, meaning he could potentially face trial and punishment like the others. Realizing that he might end up jailed with no guarantee of leniency, Mancao panicked. On May 2, 2013, in a scene worthy of a crime thriller, Cesar Mancao escaped from NBI custody. Security camera footage later showed Mancao nonchalantly walking out of the NBI detention facility in Manila, carrying a bag and wearing a baseball cap, essentially strolling to freedom. It was an embarrassment for authorities and a sign of Mancao's desperation. He went into hiding for the second time. During this period, Mancao occasionally gave phone interviews or statements, one moment taunting that he had more to reveal, the next moment offering to surrender if conditions were met. He even, famously, gave an interview in 2015 apologizing to Lacson and Estrada for implicating them, suggesting he wanted to come clean on his own fabrications. Justice Secretary Leila de Lima, frustrated by Mancao's flip-flopping, publicly challenged him to surrender and tell us the plain and naked truth, once and for all. It was hard to know what the truth was with Mancao anymore. His credibility was tattered. Mancao's fugitive run lasted 4 years. In August 2017, with a new administration in power, President Rodrigo Duterte's, Mancao finally surrendered to police authorities. By this time, the landscape of the case had changed significantly. Mancao's surrender was quiet. He was promptly detained, and his legal fate put in the hands of the court. But shortly after, in September 2017, a Manila trial court decided to acquit Mancao of all charges in the Dacer Corbito case due to lack of sufficient evidence against him. Essentially, after all his twisting and turning, Mancao walked free, perhaps seen as a man who had already been punished by fate via years on the run, and who ultimately could not be conclusively tied to the murders beyond the word of other dubious witnesses. In parallel, Michael Ray Aquino had by then returned to the Philippines as well. After finishing his US prison term for espionage, Aquino was extradited to Manila in 2011 to face the Dacer murder charges. However, Aquino's luck turned out even better. In December 2012, the Manila RTC dismissed the case against Aquino, citing technical grounds and lack of evidence tying him to the actual crime. Aquino had always maintained he was innocent and scapegoated. With the case dropped, he was released. By 2014, in a twist of fate, a US court even ordered Aquino to pay damages to the Dacer daughters in a civil suit, but Aquino himself faced no jail time in the Philippines. In fact, he quietly moved on with life. By 2022, he surfaced in news as an executive working for a billionaire businessman in Manila. To summarize this convoluted chapter, by the end of 2012, no high-ranking official remained accused in the Dacer Corbito case. Estrada was never charged. Lacson's charges were dropped and he was cleared. Aquino's case was dismissed. Mancao and Dumlao had either been dropped or acquitted. The only people left facing prosecution were those directly on the ground. The foot soldiers like Mauro Torres, Marino Soberano, Ruperto Nemeno, who turned state witness, and a few others who neither fled nor managed to cut a deal. The quest for justice for the murders of Bubby Dacer and Emmanuel Corbito stretched over many years. Witnesses came and went, suspects died or disappeared, and political winds shifted, all affecting the outcome of the case. Ultimately, the Philippine courts would only convict one person for the double murder, underscoring the case's unresolved nature. As the dust settled by the mid-2010s, the Manila Regional Trial Court proceeded to try the remaining defendants. These included several of the policemen who physically carried out the crime. Among them was Mauro Torres, who, according to witnesses, directly strangled one of the victims. Another was Marino Soberano, who had been present at both the abduction and the kill site, according to multiple accounts. Soberano had also fled for a time, but was eventually caught and brought back to face trial. Others likely included Rolando Lacasandele and William Reed, both of whom were part of the Cavite contingent, but had evaded arrest for a long time. During the trial, one significant event was the murder of a state witness. In 2009, as the case heated up with Mancao's allegations, Jimmy Lopez, one of the farmer witnesses who had confessed and testified, was shot dead in Cavite. Lopez's death raised suspicions of a targeted silencing. He was a key eyewitness to the actual murder, and his assassination further complicated the prosecution's task. Nonetheless, transcripts of his prior testimony remained on record, and other witnesses like his brother William Lopez, Alex Deloy, and Ruperto Nemeno helped fill the gaps. In September 2017, after nearly 16 years of legal proceedings, the trial court finally rendered a verdict for those before it. The court convicted former Mauro Torres of double murder, sentencing him to life imprisonment for each count. Torres's own admissions had sealed his fate. He had, at one point, admitted to being the one who strangled the victims, a damning confession that matched what others said. Conversely, the court acquitted Marino Soberano and also acquitted Cesar Mancao II in that 2017 decision, citing lack of evidence tying them conclusively to the murders. By then, Mancao had surrendered and was present to hear that acquittal. Soberano too was freed, having been cleared. Thus, Mauro Torres stands out as the lone individual serving prison time for the Dacer Corbito murders as of that verdict. One might say he was left holding the bag, the triggerman who could not escape culpability, even as the higher-ups went free. It's worth noting that if other accused like Vina had lived to face trial, or if Aquino, Lacson, or Estrada had remained accused, outcomes might have been different. But by 2017, the only ones reachable by justice were a subset of the original conspirators. Interestingly, developments continued even after 2017. Remember William Reed and Rolando Lacasandele? These two PAOCTF men were part of the operation, but had evaded arrest for over 2 decades. In January 2023, acting on old warrants, the Philippine National Police finally tracked down and arrested William Reed in Bulacan province. Reed, by then 57, had been in hiding since 2001 and was one of the country's most wanted fugitives, with a 250,000 peso bounty. Just 9 days later, authorities also arrested Rolando Lacasandele in Quezon City. These belated arrests were hailed by police as a chance to resolve loose ends. Both men would presumably face trial for their alleged roles. However, given the passage of time and the prior acquittals of their co-accused, it remains uncertain whether prosecuting them now will yield much more information or accountability. They might potentially negotiate for leniency in exchange for confirming known details, but the masterminds are long off the hook. No mastermind was ever legally identified or punished. Among the 22 original accused charged in 2001, many saw their cases dismissed or were acquitted. Only one, Torres, was convicted for the murders proper. A few others might have been convicted of lesser offences or remain indicted but not yet tried. Several key players died before justice reached them. Notably, Teófilo Viña, who was widely suspected as a chief architect, was shot dead in 2003 in Cavite, in what many suspect was an intentional silencing by unknown parties. Viña's violent end meant his secrets died with him. Likewise, the hit on Jimmy Lopez in 2009 ensured one less eyewitness for trial. The climate of intimidation around the case was very real. In the end, what stands out in the Dacer Corbito murders is the brazenness and cruelty of the act. Abducting two men in broad daylight in the nation's capital, murdering them in cold blood, and thinking one could get away with it. The conspirators nearly did. Were it not for the perseverance of investigators and a few courageous witnesses, this case might have remained a total mystery. Instead, we know much of the truth now, albeit not the whole truth. Salvador Bubby Dacer and Emmanuel Corbito's story serves as a somber reminder of the value of human life vis-à-vis power plays. Dacer moved in the world of presidents and generals, yet when he became inconvenient, all his influence couldn't save him from a violent fate. Corbito was a simple employee whose life was collateral damage in a game far above his station. The injustice of their deaths lies not only in how they were killed, but in how long it took for even partial justice, and how the suspected masterminds evaded legal reckoning. Over 2 decades later, most Filipinos have not forgotten this case. Every so often, a news item, like the 2023 arrests of the remaining suspects, brings it back into public discourse, sparking calls of justice for Dacer and Corbito once more. Their families, while thankful that one perpetrator is behind bars, likely still wonder if the full story will ever come out. Will we ever know with certainty who ordered the hit? Perhaps there are people out there, retired or elderly now, who carry that secret. If the Dacer case teaches anything, it's that secrets have a way of coming out, eventually. A spark in the dark, a trail of smoke, evidence remains. Salvador Bubby Dacer and Emmanuel Corbito have long been laid to rest. Yet their story continues to echo in Philippine history, a cautionary tale of what can happen when power corrupts and the law is subverted. Thank you so much for listening. As a new podcast, we very much appreciate your support. If you're interested in rarely heard global murder cases like this one, we encourage you to give us a follow, or even rate us 5 stars on your podcast app. If we may be so bold, it would help us out a lot. See you next time.